So thank you again for coming, and I hope everybody is enjoying this Monday afternoon. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hans Louis Charles, who is an assistant professor in the Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, where he teaches courses on risk and vulnerability assessment, disaster response, and disaster recovery in the Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness Program. He conducts applied and theoretical research focused on human and organizational behavior in disasters for better informed policy and practice in the field of emergency management. Today, his talk will be on emergency management, disaster myths, and protective action behavior following IrMaria in the US Virgin Islands. This is part of his research that utilizes a mixed methods approach and specializes in post-disaster field research. And I just wanted to let everybody know we will be having kind of an extended Q&A and informal discussion following the seminar. So if you're interested in, an informal chat, or you have additional questions coming out of the seminar, please feel free to stay in the same Zoom room for that extended discussion and Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Louis Charles, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation. And if I could ask everybody to please mute yourself so we don't have a lot of background noise for the seminar, that will be great. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Wee Yusuf, and also Julie Morgan, I believe, helped put this together. So I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Okay. All right. So can everyone see my screen well? Obviously, I can't hear you. I'm assuming you can hear me and you can see my screen. Okay. All right. So as mentioned, today I'll be talking about emergency management, disaster myths, and protective action following IrMaria in the US Virgin Islands. This research is ongoing and is in collaboration with two colleagues. One is Dr. Benigno Aguirre, retired professor from the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, specialist in collective behavior and disasters, and also Jamil Kittners, a cultural ambassador from St. Thomas, US Virgin Islands, a native of St. Thomas, and also a good college friend of mine. The first publication from this research is expected to be out in August in the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters. So, be on the lookout for that, let's say. So it's currently not available, but it will be in August. So today we're going to talk about post-IrMaria in the US Virgin Islands. A little bit about Virgin Islands. It is part of the United States. It's considered part of the insular areas. It was purchased from Denmark in 1917. The residents of the islands are US citizens. They've been citizens since 1927, so almost 100 years. Estimated population fluctuates, but it's about 105,000, more or less evenly split between St. Thomas and St. Croix, and a smaller population in St. John. It is an unincorporated territory, which we'll talk about later, but it is one of only 17 of that designation in the world, right? They're considered non-self-governing territories or colonies. So it's one of 17 remaining. The unemployment rate, let's say even before the storm, let's say, was twice the national average. Cost of living is a lot higher. The cost to purchase a home is almost twice that of mainland America, I would say. At the time of the event, there was significant debt and financial hardship occurring as well. Move forward. So just going to revisit a bit of the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. I'm sure we all remember very active season. Irma struck in early September, and then within 2 weeks, Maria also struck, right? So within that 2-week span, the islands were hit by back-to-back storms. Irma did more impact in St. John and St. Thomas, and Maria did more impact in St. Croix. So it was billions in damages, obviously, and FEMA themselves in their after action report has admitted to a lot of their failures in responding to these disasters. Of course, they were overwhelmed with responding in multiple locations, but if we look at their after action report, we see that response to the territories, Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, took longer to begin and implement. Also, you can say that proportionally they were more impacted, right? So they had greater need, but a worse response, right? Number of reasons for these failures, but and we could get to those later on in discussion as well. But we see here when it comes to sheltering, both Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands had more need for a longer period of time, right? So within this time period, right, this actually after Irma hit, and even before Maria hit, you start seeing a proliferation of media reports depicting the devastation, right? Giving it an imagery of anarchy and sort of a, let's say, a civil unrest sort of atmosphere, right? And this was throughout. So you see New York Post, New York Times, it's quite common, right, to have these sort of characterizations, depictions. And you also see a lot of discussion about looting. So this is what sort of drew me in to the media reports, was that this depiction of looters, armed looters with machetes, let's say in U.S. Virgin Islands, really took my attention because of what the literature has told us about post-disaster environments, which we'll also get to. But just in short, it's usually looting is considered more of a myth than reality for most cases, right? The post-disaster environment tends to be a lot more pro-social and therapeutic for survivors, working together to get through that period. So it's kind of stood out, and it started to be, proliferated all over, retweeted, reposted, etc. So I wanted to highlight this particular report from Fox Business, and this is the entire report, so I'm not leaving out anything here. But as you can see, St. Thomas resident Mike LaPlaque, I don't know if that's his real name or not, but he is telling his story about being and hearing stories. His story, he's telling stories of hearing stories of people being robbed at gunpoint in their house for something as small as a can of tomato, right? Which seemed a bit outrageous to me, given the history of disasters, right? So I didn't, think too much of it, but these stories come out, but they kept coming. They kept coming, and they kept being reposted, and of course shared throughout media, social media as well. And here the next day, September 12th. So this is before Maria even hit, right? This is during the aftermath of Irma, let's say. So here we have another story. Again, Fox Business. Irma destroys St. Thomas, creating eerie Walking Dead scene. And again, we have Mike LaPlaque. This time, his name is slightly different. It's LaPlace. And, he's talking about looting again and stresses that the only one doing anything was the president, Donald Trump, and that the local government was not doing anything. So again, this seemed odd, again, given the history of the research findings. And I started to think that this was made up, right? That this wasn't a real story of some sort. But I kept digging, and what I found was the actual video clip. So great. So I'm just gonna play it. Although it's a little long, I think it's a bit instructive and helps us sort of get the sense of the reporting during
So
this
people
time.
hungry without power in the middle of absolute destruction. That's what American citizens are facing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. While much attention is paid to Florida, the little-known U.S. territory bore the brunt of Irma's wrath. Here now is a witness to that devastation. Michael LaPlace is St. Thomas native. He is also a U.S. citizen. Mike, tell us what it's like there now.
Oh, it's like a mixture between a terrorist attack and The Walking Dead.
That's dramatic.
It is.
What does it look like? I mean, what are you seeing? What are people doing?
Well, they evacuated everyone in the hospital because the hospital is pretty much gone. Our governor is really downplaying this. He's not giving the attention it deserves because he's trying to save face of the bad job that they're doing. Me, my uncle, and a couple of buddies actually had to clear most of the roads so we could just check our families and get cars through because the government wasn't doing it the day after the storm. There's looting going on, whether he wants to admit it or not. The post offices are destroyed. A lot of schools are destroyed. For the most part, the kids aren't going to school anytime soon. The supermarkets, for the most part, are damaged and destroyed. Most of the gas stations have been destroyed. The line for gas that I stood in 2 days ago was 3.5 hours long just to get fuel. It's a nightmare that you don't wake up from.
And the Red Cross is not there. There is no one providing assistance.
The Red Cross, as far as we know right now, is not helping us. As far as we know, the hotels are only the Marriott paid $1 million supposedly to get their guests out of here, and they left with 250 open seats on that cruise ship, and they wouldn't take anyone else. There's a cruise ship here today evacuating tourists only. And there should be another one tonight just to evacuate tourists. But as far as the locals are concerned and everybody else who's got to get in and get out, it's not going to happen anytime soon.
And for locals, I mean, is that what you want, is to get off the island? Is that where you're trying to get? Or you need supplies and help to arrive there?
We need supplies. We need everything that we can get. As far as we've heard, Home Depot's damaged. We have one Home Depot here damaged. They're only allowing 6 people into what grocery stores are left at a time. So we're not allowed to buy any meat, any dairy products at all, just basically canned foods. So we're just right now living day to day. No diesel for generators. They just stole 250 to 300 gallons of diesel from my brother, who's an electrician. He's got a diesel stock. They stole that last night. So it's getting very hairy out there.
Wow. That's amazing. And there's no one that, I mean, other than calling out and trying to reach out to the media, is there anyone else that you've tried to reach out to for help? You say the government is not responding to the help, or to go and get the help that you need. Other than publicizing this and trying to let people know, I mean, I don't know, the federal government, have you reached out to anyone else?
Yeah, my ex-wife is doing that. And from right now, from what we see, the only one who's doing anything right now is the president. He's actually deploying forces here. There's a Navy ship that we can see outside that's acting as a temporary hospital. Trump is the only one doing anything from what anybody can see here. The local government is not doing a thing. They're just cleaning their roads, taking care of their people. Everybody else that's up here in the hills have to pretty much fend for themselves.
Wow. The pictures are just devastating. I hope that we can help you get the message out and get the help that you need.
But what we need to do, honestly,
Yeah.
is embarrass the governor. That's what we need to do, is embarrass the governor and shame him. Because today and yesterday, all he could talk about is re-election.
Mm.
And we're sick of it. He's worried about getting re-elected when we're down here trying to make ends meet. I mean, we're getting boats ready to go fishing to get fish in order to keep on going.
Wow. All right, we're saying prayers for you. We're going to stay on the story and
I would
make
like
sure.
everybody to know
Yeah.
that we all here are U.S. citizens. We're not a different country.
That's right.
Just like Guam, we are a U.S. territory. All these tourists and stuff from the States are posting all over Facebook that they need to get the U.S. people out of here and let the rest of us think for ourselves. We are U.S. citizens as well. I've lived in the States for a total of 16 years myself. I am a U.S. citizen. I pay a lot of taxes. We need help. We need help now.
Okay.
So people hungry
Oops,
without
sorry,
power.
how do I go on? Okay, sorry. So if we go back, so it is actually, this report is actually just, you know, a summarized version of that interview, right? Now, obviously, there are aspects that are taken out, because again, this is the entire report here, aspects taken out from the interview. But again, then this report is then, you know, sent around and copied and reshared numerous times by other outlets, right? Okay, so, you know, also we saw the same thing in Florida, right? The emphasis on looting, the looting aspects of the environment, post-disaster environment, right? And let's say, so this also frames our viewers, you know, perceive aftermaths, right? Especially those that have no sort of experience themselves with disasters in places around the country and around the world that, you know, may not have that sort of experience. So, you know, these sorts of media, you know, news reports sort of frame their perception of what it's like, right? And of course, you know, the United States is not unique in this regard. We also saw the same thing with the British Virgin Islands, right? And the news reports in Europe, right? Depicting the same sort of anarchy, civil unrest, looting, crime, this sort of framing of the aftermath period. Okay, so, you know, why is this important? Well, first of all, this study, the purpose of the study was to bring clarity, right, to these conflicting reports, because the governor, as Mike mentioned in his interview, disputed these claims. Also, the Virgin Islands Police Department disputed these claims, and personnel from FEMA also disputed these mass looting claims as well. So the purpose of the study was to bring clarity to the conflicting reports, right? And also, there's a few things, there's a few reasons why this is important. Okay, so I'll try to go through a few of them. But first of all, as mentioned earlier, you know, this is considered a myth more than reality. Okay, so there are quite a few common myths or misconceptions about, you know, the post-disaster environment. The most common one is that looting is a common activity after disasters, right? Other myths is that panic is a common reaction. Also, individuals flee their roles and duties as well. So there's quite a few, right? But looting is sort of like the most commonly seen one that, you know, over and over and over and over. Now, it's a bit of a debate, let's say, right, whether it's true or not. Okay, so for decades, disaster sociologists have, you know, done research on this and said time and time again, it's usually high levels of social cohesion. Individuals come together, they work together, they help each other get through it. They do make an exception, and Quarantelli makes this exception between disaster, conceptualizing a disaster, which is a catastrophe, which is another level of disaster. Let's say it's a bit of a regional destruction, not just the local destruction, right? And also that looting can be actually just appropriation with the purpose of returning, right? So it could be just something that's taken for a limited amount of time and returned, right? And they say when looting does occur, it's usually tied to other aspects of society, long-standing inequities or certain issues within the society that have occurred, or outsiders coming in taking advantage of the situation. Okay. Now, more recently, sociologists have kind of called, not sociologists, criminologists, sorry, call for a disaster of criminology, right? Disasters of crime. And they argue completely differently that, using the social disorganization theory, that, these disasters, disrupt the self-regulation of a community and allow opportunities for crime to occur. And they claim that disaster sociologists tend to focus on the immediate aftermath and emphasize the use of qualitative data, interviews, surveys, focus groups, right, observational work, as opposed to criminologists, economists tend to look more longitudinal studies wise, right, and more so quantitatively. So they say that there are limitations in what disaster sociologists have done, and that their research has shown that actually crime does occur, right? But the dispute is about more or less the timeline. They tend to agree on a number of issues, right? Whether that pre-disaster society, right, that what has been occurring can affect what will happen afterwards. But they show that fraud is quite prevalent post-disasters. You can see a lot of fraud right now in the COVID-19 pandemic as well. There's a lot of contractor fraud, insurance fraud, a number of different aspects of fraud. Again, more of a longer term timeline. They've also done studies that show burglary has increased, murder and domestic violence, given the stress of the environment and relocation to locations where there may not be a proper security setting, right? So there's a bit of an academic debate going on when it comes to whether this is a myth or not. Okay. And Hurricane Hugo, 1989 did impact St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands, and there was a lot of reports of looting and lawlessness that occurred, right? Now, Quarantelli did research here, and he found, a couple of things were sort of to blame for the situation and had to do with systemic racism and oppression that was longstanding in the community, right? But there was limitations on where and what was looted, right? And who and where these incidents occurs. So again, it's connected to pre-disaster society. Why else this is important? Well, the perception of lawlessness and perception of anarchy, which is often framed by news reports that emphasize that, influence law and emergency management practice. You see that in the state of Texas, 2019 emergency carry bill allowing individuals to carry firearms without documentation in evacuation and returning to disaster zones, and also allows them to take firearms into shelters as well, and allow shelters to accept individuals with guns. And in emergency management in general, there's a debate of whether or not there needs to be more military intervention or less military intervention, right? And the perception of lawlessness really pushes this command and control dominant paradigm of military aspect of disaster response. And lastly, protective action behavior, right? The perception, again, it's at the household level of burglaries and looting occurring has shown to impact protective action behavior, where individuals will choose not to evacuate and instead will shelter in place, right? For fear of their own house being burglarized while they are gone, right? So it can then impact what individuals do to evacuate or not. And of course, depending on your structure of your house, the stability of your house, a home, apartment, etc., it may not be the best idea to shelter in place, but this perception can influence individuals' decision to leave or not. So there are two aspects of the study, right? We want to uncover the truth about whether there was mass looting and burglary in the aftermath of IrMaria, and whether this perception of looting and burglary influenced household evacuation and sheltering behavior. Okay, so we wanted to address some of the criticisms, stated by criminologists about sociologists, and look at a longer time phase. So we wanted to look at the immediate aftermath period and then a length of time following and before, right? But obviously it's been a few years since the incident, and we're still ongoing as far as the longer term view, but we are able to, for this presentation and this paper that we're working on, that we finished, it's for the up to the year after the storm, so fiscal year of 2018, right? We wanted to also address the lack of quantitative studies when looking at this, so we did both qualitative and quantitative. We wanted to do in-person interviews and then also look at the available data when it comes to crime and burglary in particular in the US Virgin Islands. So sources of primary data come from in-person interviews. We deployed to St. Thomas about 8 weeks after the disasters occurred. We did household interviews. We did interviews with business owners and managers in key shopping areas, police officers in active duty and retired as well, senior government officials that would respond to our inquiries, and emergency management officials. We're also able to collect some key documents from their public library and also observational data as well while we were there. So interviews, as we zoom in here to the US Virgin Islands, our interviews in St. Thomas occurred in these locations, okay? And it was a purposive sampling. So we purposely looked at households that were impacted, but were still occupied, okay? So this would allow us to obviously generate answers to our questions, but a lot of individuals may have already evacuated to mainland America at that time. So something to consider is not, this is more non-probability sampling, okay? So we did interviews until we got a saturation of answers. So it turned out about 30 households were interviewed in St. Thomas and St. John. I mean, not much of the island is, most of the island is actually a national park. So the main populated areas are Cruz Bay, Coral Bay, and then I think that's Trunks Bay, Popular Beach. So those three locations, we did interviews and also did about 20 businesses across the board These are jewelry stores, grocery stores, even cab drivers, Airbnbs, restaurants, you name it, right? We interviewed those, and about 12 police officers and government officials. So we also recognize the level of, let's say, power that we hold as outsiders. Well, one of our collaborators is a local. However, we did have, a level of, let's say, autonomy and resources that many didn't have. So we wanted to make sure that we kept it as ethical as possible. And in the midst of doing it, I came up with other colleagues, sort of a checklist for conduct to make sure we're trying to be as ethical as possible and not exploit the situation, even though some of that may occur. Try to be as ethical as possible when doing post-disaster fieldwork. Sources of secondary data come from the Virgin Islands Police Department and then the FBI UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting. Now, they have different reporting methods, right? They look at different months within the year span, and then also some of the figures weren't really matching. So it made it difficult to combine the data sets. So they were kept separate for analysis, okay? And as you see here, for the FBI UCR, there's data for 2010 to 2015, but there's nothing available for 2016, 2017. And then for 2018, only one island, there's only data for one island. So, and I'll talk about that later on. So, give me 1 second here. Okay, as I move forward. All right, to findings. Okay, so post-disaster interviews revealed no evidence of mass home burglary or rampant looting activity. And on the contrary, the prevalent expressions of community solidarity from households interviewed produced well-known, long-established patterns of post-disaster collective behavior. So those interviewed express feelings of a oneness with each other, people working together, individuals that may have never spoken to each other were all of a sudden now working together, helping each other, digging out each other through rubble, helping each other get food. All of this was occurring. So that was what we found. We could not find a single individual to report either their home being burglarized or knowing another home being burglarized. And we went through, different communities of different economic levels, right? Public housing and wealthier. And there was absolutely no one we found that had any evidence of that. With the businesses, it was a little bit different because there was so here are some pictures from the St. Thomas Long-Term Recovery Group, emphasizing how individuals were working together to helping each other during this time, right? So more community solidarity and cohesion was occurring. Okay, now for the businesses, they mentioned that the governor did issue a state of emergency actually before Irma even impacted the island, right? And lasted for 55 days until October 30th. And again, they did not experience any burglaries or looting, the ones that we interviewed. There were some isolated incidents. One jewelry store in particular, I remember, said that someone stole a watch, but he knows who the individual is, and they got it back. There were some other reports in the news about grocery stores, generators being taken, but some being returned. But there was no sort of mass looting activity occurring. It just could not be found. Police officers also said that. They even expressed their surprise when reflecting on it, that there was not much crime at all that they could think of during this period. Right. Influence on protective action. So households interviewed there was no influence. The idea of burglary or looting didn't really influence their ability to evacuate or not. Maybe this could be potentially because, obviously they're not watching the news at the same time as those on the mainland, right? There's no electricity, etc. So, but either way, they said they didn't have any influence on their activities to evacuate or not. But what did influence them was previous and recent false alarms. And with Hurricane Marilyn being the most recent massive disaster or hurricane to really impact them, and that was in 1995. So it's a distant memory. And more recent reports, there were so many false alarms that had more of an impact on whether they wanted to evacuate or not. And then also the condition of the roads, both before and after the storm, their ability to seek shelter elsewhere, that had an impact as well. And here you see some pictures of the roads, and on the top left is a public housing structure, which is now being rebuilt in different locations. Okay. So the FBI data, as I mentioned, missing a lot of dates from 2016, 2017, but what we did have, did inform us a bit. So overall, I'll talk more about that, but overall, there's a steep decline. There's a steep decline in burglary in the United States Virgin Islands for the past decade, right? And for St. Thomas, which is the one island that we have the most data for, you can actually, expect a decrease of 152 incidents per year. All right. So the figures, the burglary figures to the fiscal year after the storm is 72% of a rate decrease compared to 2010, and a 52% rate decrease compared to 2015. And for reporting purposes, St. John is often coupled into St. Thomas. So this potentially is covering both St. Thomas and St. John. There's no data, well, at the time of this analysis, there was no data available for St. Croix. And again, there are years missing, but overall, we see the trajectory has been going down significantly. The VIPD, the report that they did provide showed again a decrease in all crime, except a 4% increase in burglary. So that was one thing that did stood out a bit, right? But of course, we're talking about 16 incidents of an increase from the previous fiscal year. Okay, so we wanted to dig deeper as much as we can, given the limitations of the data. But what does it look like, right? So a 17% decrease in all crime, right? So all crime is going down, but they did show a 4% increase in burglary. Now, the report allowed us to break it down by calendar year and fiscal year. By doing so, we were able to see October to December versus January to May or June, and compare them to the previous years. Okay, so I think I just showed that twice. Here we go. Okay, so by doing so, we see that the rate change actually occurred from October to December, and then it decreased again January to May. So we have potentially a temporal change here from October to December, and then January to May, a decrease again. Now, the data is limited in that it doesn't break down the incidence by island, right? Or individual months, okay? So there's some limitations there. Also, the looting reports occurred in September, which is before these figures are, October, right? So we have a state of emergency, National Guard presence in September, right? All the way till the end of October. And then we have a decrease in January. So the decrease occurs after the National Guard, the state of emergency has already been lifted. Okay, so given the fact that all crime has decreased, except for some burglary reports, and burglary and looting, of course, are not the same thing, but they are reported as the same thing in the FBI reports, given the long-standing nature of burglary versus looting. It's not really collected nationwide. But so given the fact that all crime is decreasing and burglary increases slightly within the first 4 months and then decreases after the state of emergency is lifted, right? We argue that this is more of a survival appropriation behavior and that it decreased once the proper response started to occur for humanitarian needs, both from the federal government and individual islands' emergent behavior of helping each other, right? So the incidents that did occur, we argue, are more appropriation than anything else. Okay, so discussion. All right. 1 second here. Okay, so the findings are, of course, essential for a few reasons. Okay, so of course, yes, it adds to the literature on disaster social science, as well as cognizant of, calls for criminology of disaster, but it also presents a temporal dynamic of post-disaster burglary. And given the high level of social cohesion and lack of criminality following IrMaria, the disproportionate resources focused on the protection of property, of commercial property, and curfew enforcement disregards more needed efforts to feed, shelter, and care for injured survivors, or to address any of the compounding challenges to the lives and livelihoods in a protracted recovery. Okay, so the increase and then the decrease also highlights the need to look more at this temporal dynamic of crime and not simply stating something is a myth or not a myth, and looking at one time frame or the other, right? Third, the findings dispute the widespread negative news reports depicting Virgin Islanders during the aftermath as an anarchy, civil unrest sort of environment. Okay, whereas expressions of solidarity and neighbors helping neighbors is a more accurate depiction of what happened. All right, so we understand that, FEMA has acknowledged this failure, right? And again, this is because we're arguing that the emphasis needs to be on these humanitarian needs, both in the immediate aftermath and in the long-term recovery phase, and a better use of resources. Okay. We also believe that these disorder framed news reports are, sort of, this is what the media does, of course. It has to sell news. It seeks sensationalized sort of reports, but there's another dialogue that is being left off the table by focusing on these sort of sensationalized reporting, right? So again, let's talk about these disaster myths. Why do they persist? Why do they persist? And if it was a class, I'd be able to call on some students to give me their opinion. But if we look at the work of Tyrion and others, right, they argue that media treatments of disasters both reflect and reinforce broader societal and cultural trends, socially constructed meta-narratives, and hegemonic discourse practices that support the status quo. And also, IrMaria reminds us that myths are not simply truths and untruths, but in a classical sense, myths serve as a foundation of societies that justify existing rights and customs. Okay, so what am I talking about? Well, maybe this is connected to our overall indifference as mainlanders to colonies, right? So both the origin of their status and their continuation as such, and the perception of lawlessness maybe allows us to continue to be indifferent, right? But quick history lesson on what it means to be an unincorporated territory versus an incorporated territory comes from the Insular Acts in the early 1900s, right? In which some territories were considered incorporated and unincorporated. And the Supreme Court justices that decided on this were the same ones that oversaw Plessy versus Ferguson and the idea of separate but equal. And they state that places such as Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands are inhabited by an alien race, incapable of becoming American citizens, and therefore were given a designation of unincorporated territories. So we have 4 million Americans that are not able to participate in presidential elections. They do not have voting representatives in the US Congress as well. So 4 million is bigger than 40% of mainland states. Okay, so we have this empire, let's say, right, with colonies where individuals are second-class citizens, and we seem to be indifferent, whether it's at the government level or individual level, about that status. So media framing and conversations about lawlessness post-disaster obfuscate what really needs to be discussed and this ongoing colonization project of the United States. So it's unsurprising when individuals as high up as the president may not know that he's also the president of the US Virgin Islands. Now, as I mentioned, the media is doing what the media does. And I should also state that Mike did exist, right? Mike LaPlaque, he did exist, and he was stating at least some of what he wanted to say, but we need to really parse his words a bit. I don't know if I could do this again. I'm not
So
going to play the
people
whole
hungry
thing,
without
but if
power.
we go
Government,
if we go to the end of what he's saying, what he's mentioning, he's talking about being in the hills, right? And the local government not doing anything. Now, the local government seems to be more of his issue, and also the governor itself, right?
he's actually deploying forces here. There's a Navy ship that we can see outside that's acting as a temporary hospital. Trump is the only one doing anything from what anybody can see here. The local government is not doing a thing. They're just cleaning their roads, taking care of their people. Everybody else that's up here in the hills have to pretty much fend for themselves.
Wow. The pictures are just devastating. I hope that we can help you get the message out and get the help that you need.
But what we need to do, honestly,
Yeah.
is embarrass the governor. That's what we need to do, is embarrass the governor and shame him. Because today and yesterday,
Okay, so I'm not trying to negate what he's saying. What I'm saying is we need to really parse his words a bit, right? He's focusing on the governor and he's in the hills. So it's a small community, and he's actually a well-known individual. And it turns out that he does have a personal, vendetta against the governor and the local government. And he lives in an affluent area in which the governor did not deploy military forces, National Guard forces, because he did not perceive them as being in need. So he was upset that the governor wasn't sending the National Guards into the richest part of the island to protect them. So this was him lashing out at that incident. So news media, they're not going to necessarily investigate that, but what they've done is taken this one person's perspective, right, and vendetta, and sort of blasted it out as what was occurring, right? Now, what about Mike and others that believe in this, right? Where does this come from? Where does this stem from? What is the history of this, right? So elite fare, okay? Elite fare and the plantocracy. So this has a long tradition. There's a long tradition throughout the Caribbean and in the United States mainland as well, of post-disaster civil disorder, right? Government, government resources are used to protect the financial interests of the community, okay? So Solnet, kind of coined the phrase elite fare, right? And Mulcahy, I always get his name wrong, but Mulcahy kind of covers the plantation environment in the greater Caribbean space. And he talks about, this elite fare whenever a hurricane occurred, because the plantocracy always believed that this will be a time for the enslaved Africans and the enslaved Amerindians to rise up. So there's an emphasis on controlling bodies, especially Black bodies, during this period. And it has kind of continued on to present day. So, but if we look at the specific history of St. John and the US Virgin Islands, right? There was a slave revolt that occurred in the aftermath of a disaster, in 1733, right? But it was not the hurricane itself, it was the draconian slave codes that restricted movement of bodies months after the storm occurred, and there was a severe drought as well. Okay, so the enslaved Africans took up arms against the Danes at the time and successfully established their own rule over the island. They were defeated a year later, or the year after, by French troops that came to assist the Danes. The leaders and the rebels were shot, beheaded, tortured to death, and burned alive in public display. Following hurricanes in the 1770s, the 1780s, the Danish ruling class of St. John and St. Croix implemented stringent restrictions and curfews on enslaved populations following hurricanes. And during the post-emancipation era in the Caribbean, colonial governments continued the routine post-hurricane militia patrol, curfew restriction, anti-looting and appropriating ordinances with severe penalties, including forced prison labor and public whipping with a cat o' nine. So what I want to do is sort of juxtapose that report that we saw by Mike with this report from, I believe they are called, what are they called? The storm chasing video, right? This actually occurs the same day. This report actually, this recording actually occurs the same exact day as that interview that you saw on Fox Business channel that you saw. I want you to kind of compare the two.
Upstairs, they lost the entire roof. You know, that was my worst experience. And of course, after that, driving to the islands and seeing folks that basically lost everything. Folks lost their lives. It was rough. You know, so as a born and raised Virgin Islander, I ain't going to place, you know. I ain't going to place. I put up years ago. Lockwood School, up my school right there. Maryland knocked down Lockwood School. And of course, you see that school still standing because that's one of the newest schools here. Because of Maryland. Cancrain, we never got rebuilt, but we're going to need some rebuilding this year. That's why I went to Cancrain and CHS and UVI 95 when I graduated is Maryland. And that's when I went to UVI. I still ain't going to place. I'm going to be here. But I just need us as a people to be more sensitive and us as a people to wake up and understand that together we could get through this. But we need to be more sensitive. Good morning. John from Racetrack. We're here at Racetrack to serve the people of Virgin Islands in this state of a disaster. We're here for the people of Virgin Islands and we'll serve them all around the clock. We're here for them. God bless them and we love the Virgin Islands. How was the storm experience for you? It was the worst I've ever seen. Sustain any damages to your house and to the businesses? Yeah, we did, but we're still surviving. That's the most important thing. How has it been now filling up everyone? How long have you seen the lines? I've seen the lines long, but the people of the Virgin Islands are beautiful, they're patient, and we're here for them. Got you there, man.
I hate to interrupt, but it is 4:30, so I do want to let people know that if they have to leave, that's perfectly understandable.
So we going home? Where you
from?
Chicago.
Chicago. How long would you stay here?
Ended up being 2 weeks.
How was the hurricane experience?
It was tough, but I love how the community banded together.
All right. What hotel did you stay at?
We were at Sapphire.
Okay. All right. Safe trip home, man. All right. Be good. How was the hurricane experience?
It was terrible. And we were staying at a resort without a concierge or anyone to help us. So we've been stranded. And the manager of Sapphire Beach turned off our water, but had water for himself the whole week.
Sorry to hear that. Hope you have a safe trip home. Tell me who you are, where you're from, how was your hurricane experience? Go.
Tyler Odell, my mother Rachel Signorella. We're from Monroe, Michigan. Pretty scary experience, but just happy to be going home now.
We are blessed. We had food, water, shelter. It was Sugar Bay we stayed at. It was amazing.
Great. What was the most terrifying part of the storm for you?
We were in a bunker,
Being in
so
the
we didn't
bunker,
hear any
we
of
didn't
it.
know anything that was going on. There was no TV, so we had no idea
You
what
could
was
just
going
hear
on
furniture moving upstairs.
When you came out and you saw it, what was your reaction?
Devastating.
Devastating, yeah.
Will you go through another hurricane?
Would I go through one? Not,
Not
I
on
wouldn't
purpose.
want to.
Not on purpose.
All right, so the boat is taking you from here to where?
Florida? I'm hearing Florida.
Here to Florida, and then you got to fly home?
We're gonna get a rental car back home.
Okay.
Okay, so as I wrap up, I just want to say a couple things. So we need to, as the gentleman mentioned, right? We need more sensitivity.
While I was battling
we need
my
more
storm
sensitivity,
downstairs,
right? This is
the
a time
last entire
period
move.
in which humanitarian needs are the utmost important, and not instilling fear in each other. They need to guide our use of public resources in the aftermath of disaster. And we also need to understand what is occurring in our insular areas, right? If we look at this study and the lack of secondary data, this is a long-standing problem where it is a neglect within these spaces, whether on purpose or not. It has been argued that this is on purpose, but it still stands that there's a neglect. And there's a lack of statistical data available to this day. Also, this emphasizes the value of post-disaster field research and qualitative data, given the fact that secondary data is not going to be available for some time afterwards, but must be done in an ethical manner. There were a lot of issues that were raised during the interviews that are outside the scope of the study, but of equal importance, and we could talk about that in the Q&A. I know I'm over the time limit, and I apologize for that, but I just want to say thank you to everyone for having me, and I'm here for any questions.
Thank you, Hans. I'm going to turn off the recording, but I welcome any questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question.